Okay, it's a little after 1 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Rabbi Kelman can't make it today, but I'm hosting it myself here, which is fine. And I'm excited to return with you to Who Wrote the Siddur, Part 2. Last time we explored some of the early foundations of the Siddur. We talked about different possibilities of who wrote the Siddur and indeed how many different people in different eras contributed to the Siddur. And then we talked a little bit in particular about the era of Tanakh and the era of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and also the fact that Tefillah was not written down in any of these time periods that we discussed, but it was all preserved orally. In this class, I'd like to build on that foundation in that, as we saw, there were a number of tefillot and a number of prayers that are very familiar to us that we still say today in our Siddur that were already there in the time of the Mishnah, in the time of the Gemara. But the question is, how specific was the wording? Is the wording something that was already completely fixed, or were there really more variation? And I think what we'll see to get today is really throughout the Gaonic period, that's the time after the Gemara, and really into the medieval period, there are differences in wording in different communities. I mean, and of course, there are differences in wording today also in different communities. There are many nuschaot. You can daven Ashkenaz, you can daven Sfard, Edot HaMizrach, Chabad, and Italian, and all different possibilities, Yemenite. And of course, like everyone has a slightly different nusach. But I guess what we'll see today, hopefully, is that there really was a lot more variation before things got standardized later in the Gaonic period and in the medieval period. And I think this move towards standardization will also teach us something really interesting about the difference in the way they thought about tefillah in Bavel, in Babylonia, and in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, in the, like, let's say, like 600, 700 or so, like early in the Gaonic period after the time of the Gemara. And I think that should be a very interesting window into sort of why we do things the way we do today and how it differs from the way things were done at one point. Um, Okay, so let me begin by asking a question, and then we'll look at the source sheet and try to figure this out. So, Shmona Esrei, we've talked about that sort of the central part of our tefillah, our davening. It's even called tefillah. Sometimes it's called the Amida. Sometimes it's just called tefillah. So, Shmona Esrei, the word means 18. But how many blessings, how many brachos actually are there in our Shemon Esrei today?
19.
There are 19. There are not 18. So the question is, how did we get from 18, because presumably there were 18 originally, that's what the name would suggest, to 19, which we have today. So now I'm going to share the source sheet, and we're going to look at some sources on this issue. Oh, you know what? I should also share it in the chat because that's something that we usually do. That way people can access it on their own also. And I do think in particular, in this case, that might be helpful. So I'm sharing this with everyone. Here is the link to the source sheet as well. And now I will also share it on my screen. Let's see here. Okay, yes. Now we are sharing it. I'm sharing it on my screen. Let's see, there is like a bar over here that I want to move out of the way. Okay, I think it's out of the way now. Okay, very good. Okay, so let's look at source number one. This is the Gemara in Brachos, 28b. And the Gemara has our question. Hane tamne sre. You were talking about 18 blessings? Sare havyan. There's 19. Rabbi Levi. So Rabbi Levi says, Birkas haminim biyavne tiknua. So one of the brachos is against the heretics, against the slanderers. Sometimes it's translated the malshinim. We often say in our nosach, in our Ashkenaz nosach. And he says that one came later. That was established in Yavne Tana Rabbanan. We have a brisa, Shimon HaPakoli, Hister Shmona Esrei Brachas L'fnei Rabban Gamliel Al HaSeder B'Yavne. This idea that the Shimon HaPakoli, he's the one who established the Shmona Esrei in front of Rabban Gamliel in Yavne, and we saw a piece of this before also. Amar Lahav Rabban Gamliel Chachamim. Rabban Gamliel said back to the sages, Klum Yesh Adam Shiodei Lesakin Birkas Haminim. Is there someone who knows how to have a blessing or an invocation against the heretics, which may have been Christians? It's not entirely clear here. I'm not going to get into that so much. Aban Shmuel Hakatan Vizikna. So Shmuel Hakatan got up and he established it. So what the Gemara seems to be saying is there were 18, And then the Chachamim, the sages, felt the need to add one more, a 19th, and that was what we have today as V'lim al Shanim, or Laminim against the heretics, the Meshumadim sometimes against the apostates, it's sometimes worded. It's really a bracha that's actually gone through a lot of evolution in terms of the wording, which we're not going to get into so much here also. But it's also something that was subject to a great deal of censorship over the years because it is an invocation essentially against people that we feel are wronging the Jewish community in some way. And so that type, especially if it's a Christian era, there are Christians who are not going to be happy with this. So it does get censored. But in any event, and changed. But in any event, this is the Gemara's reconstruction of how we got from 18 to 19. So I want to show you something though, which really complicates this and makes the Gemara's answer a little harder to accept on a historical level, at least. And for this, we're going to actually go to page 4 of the source sheet. And this is a Shmona Esrei found in the Cairo Geniza. Okay, so I'm going to go down to this one on page 4 now, the Shmona Esrei from the Cairo Geniza. So what is the Cairo Geniza? Probably a lot of you are familiar with it, at least in broad contours. The Cairo Geniza was a collection of some 400,000 Jewish manuscript fragments and other documents that were kept in the storeroom, basically the attic, I think, of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo, which is called Fustat in Egypt. And these manuscripts, there's just so much there. We've got everything from like the 6th century to the 19th century that was stored up there. We've got Middle Eastern stuff, we've got North African stuff, we've got Andalusian, Spanish Jewish history there. It's really the largest and most diverse collection of medieval manuscripts in the world. Now, this was not a complete secret from the Jewish world throughout its history, but most people didn't know about it. There were a few who saw it earlier, but really the way the Geniza became popular, the Geniza became known was due to two Scottish scholars and twin sisters, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. In 1896, they went to the Ben Ezra synagogue. They saw the Geniza. They took some fragments. They were like, sort of interested in manuscripts. They brought them back to Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter at that time was a lecturer at Cambridge University. And Schechter looked at this fragment, that one of the fragments they brought him, and he sees, oh, look at this. This actually is a copy of the book of Ben Sira, in Hebrew. Now, Ben Sira was a book we consider part of the Apocrypha. It's a non-canonical book from the Second Temple period that didn't quite make it into the Tanakh. Although I will say that Chazal, the sages, were actually very happy with Ben Sira. It's of the Apocrypha, I think it's the only one that's quoted in the Talmud. Sometimes it's a book similar to Mishlei, it's sort of a book of wisdom. It's a book of sayings, of proverbs. And a lot of good religious sentiments in there. But Ben Sira had only survived in the Greek because it was preserved in the church literature in the Catholic Church, but had not survived in Hebrew. But everyone knew that there was a Hebrew original, but we didn't have it. Or people thought there was probably a Hebrew original, we didn't have it. And then Solomon Schechter lays his eyes on this and says, hey, like this is actually the original the Hebrew of Ben Sira that we didn't have for all these years. So he gets very excited. He goes to Cairo. He goes to the Geniza. He spends months there, taking as much as he can, and the authorities there in the synagogue allow him to take whatever he wants, and he brings it back to England, and eventually the collection spreads across the world and really became a treasure trove of our documents. It's actually really interesting. I heard a lecture recently from Michelle Margolis, who's the librarian, Jewish librarian at Columbia University, and she was saying that between the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is something that was written in the Second Temple period and then preserved in the cave, and we found in like the 1940s, 1950s, and the Cairo Geniza, we're talking in the 600s or whatever, we don't really have almost anything. There's very, very little Jewish written work. So like the Geniza is sort of our main sort of source for like old written sources for the Jewish literature, and we can learn so much from what we found there. Among the Geniza fragments, a very important part of the Geniza fragments are pieces of Siddurim, pieces of prayer books, because this is something now people were starting to write down in this time period. And what is very interesting about the fragments that we mostly find in the Cairo Geniza is they are very different than the Siddur we have today. They don't represent our Nusach, which, as we said, is based on Siddur of Amram Gon in Bavel, starting around the year 800, 900 or so, but they represent a different strand of Nusach. A Nusach, we believe, is from Eretz Yisrael, from Israel. Basically, the idea would be that the Jews of Israel, due to various persecutions, at least some of them at some point, fled to Cairo in Egypt. Again, not that far. We're not talking like not as far as some other places. And this was in the wake, people think it was in the wake of the Crusades. But they brought with them their Nusach HaTfilah. They brought with them their own Siddurim. And so while this fragment that I'm about to show you from the Geniza dates to the 12th century. So we're talking like already after the time of the Goanim, after the time of the standardization of the Siddur under Amram Gon, it reflects a nusach that is probably much earlier. So they were at least were still using it in Cairo in the 12th century. How do we know this is a nusach from Eretz Yisrael and not from Bavel? I mean, I think the simple answer is that there are parts of it, and we'll see a tiny bit of this as we go on, that are similar to what's recorded in the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi being the Jerusalem Talmud from the land of Israel. And if that's the case, I think it's reasonable to surmise that this was an active nusach that was used in the land of Israel. And indeed, it is different from the one in Bavel. And I want to just highlight for you a few pieces of this because I think it's super interesting. And then we'll also get back to our question about the bracha of Lama Shinim or Laminim. So you can see over here the Shemona Esrei starts. You can look on the right-hand column. It starts, we got some similarity. I'll just say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu Elokei Avraham Elokei Yitzchak Elokei Yaakov Hakel Gadol Gibor V'Hanara Kel Elyon Konei Shemayim V'Aretz. All right, sounds the same. Now we start to already see differences in wording, and I don't know what to make of these necessarily, but I'll just point out there were differences in wording. Maginenu, Magen Avosenu, Miftachenu B'Chol Dor V'Adar Baruch atah Hashem Magen Avraham. Same ending to the bracha. Some of the words are different. Next bracha also atagi bor mashpil geim. Again, similar but different. The words are not exactly the same. Now let's go down one more bracha. This is bracha number 3, which we have as ata kadosh v'shimcha kadosh. That's what we have in Nusach Ashkenaz at least. What do we have over here? Kadosh atav v'nara shemecha. You are holy. Your name is awesome. Ve'ena lo kami baladecha baruch atah Hashem hakel kadosh. Okay, different wording, but what's interesting about this one is maybe to some of you, this wording actually sounds really familiar. Does anyone want to venture a guess if it sounds familiar to you where this is from? Where do we see this in our tefillah?
It came from the Tanakh.
Yamim Noraim.
Yamim Naraim. Yes, exactly. This is the nusach of Yamim Naraim. So what's going on? How come we use this nusach, which is the ancient Eretz Yisrael nusach, on the Yamim Naraim? It would seem that what happened is that for reasons that are not 100% clear, but probably has to do with trade routes and migration patterns, that the nusach of Eretz Yisrael migrated to Italy and maybe some other places, and then over to Ashkenaz. But we're going to see throughout this class that there's actually a deep connection between the ancient nusach Eretz Yisrael and nusach Ashkenaz in particular, but not necessarily in like nusach in the Sephardi nusach. That same transfer did not occur. So I just wanted to point that out first, that we see this parallel here. And I'm not going to go through every bracha here. We'll go on to the next page, and we can see some other things that stand out. Okay, I guess we'll do the one. Okay, let's see. Okay, look over here. Minim, on the top of the left-hand column over here. So we have this bracha, l'meshuma dim alti tikva. As I said, this is against apostates, but it's a similar bracha. So this is in here. Okay. But if you look down here now to Yerushalayim, what is going on over here? Rachem Hashem Elokeinu b'rachamecha harabim al Yisrael amecha v'al Yerushalayim yirecha v'yal tziyim mishkan kavodecha v'al hechalecha v'al me'onecha v'al malchus b'deisa Mashiach tzidkecha baruch atah Hashem Elokei David bonei Yerushalayim. And then it goes next to Shema Hashem b'kol tefillah, which is similar to our Shema Kolenu and Shema Tefillah. So what bracha here? What happened over here?
It shows that originally this was one bracha, and above it, split it up into two. And as a practical matter, the meaning was not added afterwards. It was there all along. And the whole story is just one of these stories that's made up to account for a fact that they had no explanation for.
Okay.
But operationally speaking, it's clear that originally these two bracha were one bracha. By the way, you didn't point out that in the Machaya Meitim bracha, other than the siyum, there's not a word about bringing dead human beings to life. It's just about how the rain brings the dead plants and grass to life. And presumably the siyum means mechayah mektim in the sense that, Hashem can bring, the rain brings what looks dead to life. Doesn't mean it brings back what is really dead. It means what looks like it's on the verge of death is brought back to life. I mean, you eluded that bracha 1, 2, 3, but that's also a major difference between what we have and what the Geniza has.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. I hadn't actually thought about that so much. I do appreciate that. And again, we could probably study this whole thing in depth and talk about all the different brachos and what they show. And I want to also say that it's not necessarily that everything here is older than what we have. I think that some of this is developing in parallel with the Nusach in Bavel and Babylonia. So it could be that both of them are extant at the same time. And certainly when this Siddur fragment was written, this we're talking the 12th century. So already our Siddur in Bavel, which had the 19 brachos, is very much active and very much being used throughout the Jewish world. But the point is, as Yehudi was saying here, that it seems that in terms of the 18 brachos, it seems like the bracha against the minim, against the heretics, was always there, but the Yerushalayim and Tzemach were combined into one bracha. And that's why it really was 18 and not 19. And later those two were split. And again, it seems like in the Gemara, historically, they were not aware of the origin of the 18, and they didn't realize that it was because Yerushalayim and Tzemach were combined into one bracha. So this is
I
something really
I have
interesting we see.
I have two very quick questions.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yeah, ask your questions. Then I think we're gonna pause questions until later.
And it 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 can when you read the bracha for Yerushalayim,
Hmm.
it sounded very much to me like the bracha on the benching.
Yes, yes, I agree. It does. And I think that's also an important point. I thank you for highlighting that because I do think that one thing we see again about the wording of the Siddur, like we have the idea of Yerushalayim, right? So the tefillah was established. We have to say a bracha about Yerushalayim. What is the wording of that bracha supposed to be? There are various different versions out there. And it seems like the one in benching and the one in Shemona Esrei, they're all kind of developing in parallel. That the wording gets it hits on certain points, but that it different nuscha, different parts of tefillah even adopted different wordings.
And my other comment is that all 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 the language is different in some of the bracha. If you learn the rules for 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 Mona after in 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 Talmud bracha, it's still stay all the notes that you've shown us so far all seem to conform to the basic set of rules. Like three after three.
A Bavli bracha only represents the Bavli point of view. You have to also look at Yerushalmi bracha before you draw any conclusions. Another thing, Yosef, the bill with
Hmm.
LLK, David Ubanei Yerushalayim, the Bavli definitely knew that Nusach because it polemicizes against it. In
Hmm.
Masechet Sanhedrin, there's a whole thing about why do we say LLK Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, but not LLK David? And I think it's in Sanhedrin 107, around there. And it seems David asked Hashem to basically put his in there too. And Hashem said, well, those three people stood up to the test. And David says, test me, test me. I think you know the rest of the story, right?
Yeah.
Hashem says,
Mhm.
yeah, I'll test you, all right. I'll even test you and tell you what I'm testing you with a Devar Erva. And we all know how that turned out. And so the Bobby ends up by saying, that's why we don't say Elokei David. So that's clear that they knew the Eretz Yisrael Nusach, and they're trying to put it down.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Yeah. Let's. I think there's been some feeling that we should try to stick more to the presentation right now. We're gonna do questions more at the end. So let me just mute people for now, but people can unmute themselves if necessary. But okay. Yeah. But thank you for that. And let me share the source sheet again, and I'll continue a little bit here. So we can see some other features, both of this Shemona Esrei, and then move on to some other discussions as well. So if we look down on page 6 of the source sheet, I just want to point out something else interesting here. This is the bracha of the avoda. This is the bracha of ritzei. This is part of our davening today as well. But as you see here, the language is again different. It says ritzei Hashem Elokeinu Eshkon B'Tzion V'Yavducha Avadecha B'Yerushalayim. Favor us, dwell in Zion. And we'll serve you in Yerushalayim. But look I want to highlight the ending in particular. The ending is Baruch Atah Hashem, Blessed are you, Hashem she'oscha b'yirah na'avod, that we serve you in reverence. And this should also sound familiar to many of you who daven Nusach Ashkenaz, because this is what we actually say on Yom Tov. In Musaf, when we do Birkas Kohanim, we include this language instead of the usual language of Hamachazir Shechina Tolitzion, of God returning his presence to Zion. We use this one of we will serve you exclusively. And this indeed is again a Nusach of Eretz Yisrael. And let me show you how we know this. Let's go back up on the source sheet. If you look at source number 3 in the Mishnah and Sota, the Mishnah talks about what the Kohen Gadol is doing, or what the high priest is doing on Yom Kippur. What is the tefillah that he's going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he's bringing the incense, but he's also praying, he's also setting up the tefillah. And it says, Birkos Kohen Gadol Ketzad. What were the blessings that the Kohen Gadol says? And you skip to the next bolded point. He says, Uve'asor shebechumash hapekudim, and he reads the part in Sefer Bamidbar about the offerings of the day. Kore al Peh, so he reads that not from a scroll. Muvarach aleh shmona brachos. Then he says 8 blessings. Al Torah, 1 on the Torah. Al ha'avoda, 1 on the service. Okay, and then it goes through other ones. But let's see, what does it mean on the service? What does he say? So if you look at the Yerushalmi here in Sota, source number 4, Al ha'avoda, what does the Kohen Gadol say? What's the bracha he makes on the temple service? She'oscha levadcha b'yiran avoda. We serve you with reverence. So what we see here is that according to the Yerushalmi, according to the Nusach that was in vogue in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel at the time when the Yerushalmi was written, so 4th century, whatever, of the Common Era, 3rd century, whatever, I forgot exactly when it is, around that time. So they're using this Nusach and not the Nusach that is then used in Bavel of Hamachazir Shechina Tolitzion. And we'd see again this one from this text from the Cairo Geniza reflects the Eretz Yisrael Nusach and not the Nusach from Bavel. So that's another example of some differences, but also another example of how it's interesting in Ashkenaz that this Nusach did become part of our Shmona Esrei, but only in the repetition of Shmona Esrei on the holidays when we do Birkas Kohanim. So it's interesting how that transfer again happened in Ashkenaz, and we'll talk about that a little more later, but you get the basic picture. There's this one more example of this in the Shmona Esrei also of a similar transfer to Ashkenaz. If you look at the end again, I'll just mention it very briefly. You have the bracha of Sim Shalom, of peace at the end, which is here titled Birkas Kohanim, because the Kohanim are the ones indeed who bless the people with peace. It ends Baruch Atah Hashem Oseh HaShalom instead of Hamavarech Esamo Yisrael B'Shalom. In Ashkenaz, we tend to the end Hamavarech Esamo Yisrael B'Shalom, but Oseh HaShalom is something we use in Ashkenaz again throughout the period of the Yamim Noraim. So again, we see this sort of interesting transfer from Eretz Yisrael to Ashkenaz, which we will get back to, but I think we've already discussed in broad contours. Okay, so we see some very interesting things, I think, about this Shmona Esrei. This variant we have from the Geniza and about Nusach Eretz Yisrael and how it was different than Nusach Bavel. Now, of course, and there are other interesting things too. I didn't put this on the sheet, but we say in Mariv we end the bracha after Shmona Esrei, after Shema Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, who redeems Israel. Now, in the Yerushalmi, it has a different Nusach. In the Yerushalmi, it has Melech Tzur Yisrael V'Go'alo, the king, the rock of Israel and redeemer. And what's really interesting is, and this is less known nowadays but it used to be very familiar to people in Nusach Ashkenaz as well, because in Western Europe at least, they used to insert Maraviot. They used to insert piyutim into Mariv on the holidays, on like Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. We don't do this anymore. We're about to talk about piyutim, about poetry in a second. We don't do this anymore. But when you insert piyutim into Mariv, you actually end again with the Eretz Yisrael version. Melech Tzur Yisrael V'Go'alo gets changed to that. So another example of that. And again, we've talked a lot about how Nusach, changes in different places, and there's all sorts of interesting examples of that. How different traditions have preserved different things. One that I find particularly interesting also is, we'll just throw it out there, is that another thing we do on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and in that period, is in Kaddish, instead of just saying Le'ela min kol birchasa, that God is above all blessing, we say Le'ela Le'ela. We say Le'ela twice, sort of as a special thing for the Yamim Noraim. But actually, other nuschaot say that all the time. Actually, the Italian nusach in their everyday siddur, that's just the nusach in Kaddish. They have le'ela le'ela. Why I don't actually know offhand why one developed and in different places, but it seems again like a lot of these little variations and little differences are really, really quite old. And they go back to texts that were in use in some places and not other places. And it's just interesting to see how these things grew and transferred over time. So I think that's enough right now for differences in nusach. But I want to talk about what might be even a more fundamental difference between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. Not just the wording, but I think in their whole approach to the way they saw tefillah in this time period. We're talking, period of the Gaonim, 500s, 600s, 700s, around this time period. And and because I think that although Nusach Eretz Yisrael doesn't really exist today to the degree it did, this Nusach we saw from the Geniz in Cairo was still being used in the 12th century, but it's certainly not in use today anymore. And as I said, there are only echoes of Nusach Eretz Yisrael in our Ashkenazi Siddur, for example, and even fewer echoes in other Nuschaot. But the other aspect of Nusach Eretz Yisrael, which is piyut, which is poetry, I think has had a much more enduring impact on our siddur today. I think that the nusach aspects, a lot of it sort of died out with Siddur of Amram Gon and how Siddur of Amram Gon spread across the whole Jewish world and influenced everyone so greatly. But when it comes to piyut, I think that Nusach Eretz Yisrael actually had a really great influence. So the land of Israel was the birthplace of poetry, of inserting Hebrew poetry into the standard fixed davening. This is around the year 500 or 600. The word piyut and poetry actually come from the same root word in Greek. In the original context, piyut represented a very different way of thinking about prayer. Instead of the fixed siddur, which we have today, where we say the same words every day or every Shabbos, every holiday, this was not the case in the land of Israel. The prayers actually varied to a certain degree from week to week, depending on the time of year, depending on the Torah portion, and often the paitan or the poet would come to the shul with a new composition for that week. And they would sort of exhibit this liturgical virtuosity almost by using these new improvisations, these new compositions. So how would this work exactly? So let's say the chazan is now, everyone says they're silent Shemona Esrei, and the chazan's repeating the Shemona Esrei. And so the chazan will say the opening of the bracha, and presumably the chazan will say the conclusion of the bracha, but in the middle, the words might be different depending on the week. So maybe there will be some kind of piece, some kind of new piyut, some kind of new poetry. Some scholars have even suggested that these were actually read quite dramatically, different, maybe using different voices, different intonations, different kinds of congregational responses, a little bit even maybe like theater. These piyutim that were inserted into the Shemona Esrei are called krovot. That is the term for them. Today we're less familiar with the term krovot, but you might have heard the term yotzrot. Sometimes we say yotzrot on certain Shabbos, like the 4 parshios before leading up to Pesach. Some shuls still say something called yotzrot. Yotzrot really are krovot. They're insertions into the Shemona Esrei. But the technical term Yotzer refers to a piyut that's inserted into the bracha of Yotzer Or, which is the bracha before Shema. So and today even, we still say some krovot as well. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have a lot of piyutim. These were krovot. These were insertions into the Shemona Esrei. Now, we don't say, oftentimes we've broken them up. We say pieces of these piyutim, and we don't say all of them. We certainly also don't do what they did in ancient Eretz Yisrael, which was they would sometimes leave out some of the text of the brachot and just have the piyutim. We would say all the text of the brachot, but we might add some piyutim as well. And certainly, we often are just sort of, there are exceptions. There's some piyutim that are very meaningful, and we're all saying together and stuff like that. On Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, some of them are also all saying sort of quietly to ourselves and rushing through them. That certainly wasn't the way they were originally recited. Certainly also no one had a text of these in front of them, so everyone was just saying what the chazan was saying them, and possibly very dramatically, which is very different than what we do today. But in any event, we do see this vestige, and not just a vestige, but still a very important part of our tefillah is this piyutim, but it was much more extensive in ancient Eretz Yisrael. And let's see. Let's talk about a couple examples. So one example of a piyut, which I think is pretty well known today, is Unatana Tokef. Now you're going to tell me Unatana Tokef isn't from ancient Eretz Yisrael. Unatana Tokef was written in Europe in the 11th century by Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, after he died, as he was dying a martyr after being tortured by the archbishop of the city. That's what it says in the Art Scroll Siddur, and that's the story that I always heard about the authorship of Unatana Tokef. The problem with that story, and this is kind of the opposite of many things. Many things we think are really old and they're actually newer. This is an example of something we thought was newer and it was actually really old because we found it in the Cairo Geniza, and we didn't find it at the top. We found it like closer to the bottom. So the layer that it was found in suggested it was composed centuries earlier in the land of Israel. And what was Unatana Tokef? Well, it was basically what it is today. It was a piyut that was recited before Kedusha on Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. Technically, the type of piyut that is the piyut that is recited before Kedusha is called the siluk, or the one you withdraw from. It's the one you depart from the piyutim to the Kedusha. And it's one. There were many others. There's many other silukim that were in vogue and were used in different places. And Unatana Tokef was just so popular and so well known that it kind of became the one that everyone uses on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But this is an example of an ancient Eretz Yisrael poem. We don't know exactly who wrote it. There was a very important. There were a couple of very important paitanim in Eretz Yisrael. One of them was someone by the name of Yanai. Now, Yanai, for many, many years, again, until the Geniza was discovered, we only had one thing written by Yanai, and that is Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla. What is Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla? Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla is something we say, Ashkenazim say at least, on the first night of the first Pesach Seder. After the Seder is over, when we're singing some additional songs, we recite Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla, which is it's basically about various things, the poem about things that happened, God killing the Egyptian firstborn, and then talking about other things that happened at midnight, other miracles that God did at midnight. Now, Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla, it turns out, is actually a very small piece of a much longer krova called a Kedushta, which was a 9-part poem which embellished the first 3 blessings of the Shemona Esrei. And this was written by Yanai. And in fact, this was the only known work of Yanai until much more of his over was discovered in the Cairo Geniza. And what's interesting about this Kedushta and Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla is it seems to have been composed for the Shabbos where they would have read that parsha. Now we say, okay, that's Parshat Bo. That's the parsha where the plagues happened, the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. But actually, in Eretz Yisrael, there was no such thing as Parshat Bo, because they were on a triennial cycle, which means they completed the Torah once every 3 years, not once every 1 year. And this is attested to in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli as well, actually, that this was indeed the cycle there. And they started one of their portions with those words, Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla. Those words about the plague of the firstborn. That was the beginning of one of their parshiot of the triennial cycle, which is in the middle of our Parshat Bo. And this is the Shabbos that Yanai wrote Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla, and this 9-part Kedushta for, which, as I said, we not only do we not read the Torah that way anymore, but we also don't have a place really to recite that whole piyut. I think other portions of it are actually in the Yotzrot for Shabbos Hagadol as well, but the main place we know it from now is a portion of it that was inserted into the Haggadah. Another important paitan of this period was Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, who maybe you have heard of. Rabbi Elazar HaKalir wrote many, many things that we still say today, and his are very, very complicated. His rhyme schemes are complex. He weaves in all sorts of midrashic allusions. He frequently even coins new Hebrew words. And it's very frustrating, I think, for modern readers to understand them, but they are indeed very interesting. We don't know so much about his life. We do believe he lived in the late 6th or early 7th century, and he's very influential in the Nusach Eretz Yisrael. One thing he's particularly well known for even today is he wrote a lot of the keynote that we say on Tisha B'Av, and if you were here for my lecture on Tisha B'Av, we talked a little bit about that, in particular what I'm going to read for you in source number 5, just to give you an example on some of his writing. This is one of the keynote he wrote, Echa Asta Ba'apecha, and the keynote begins over here in source number 5. How did you rush in your fury to exterminate your faithful ones at the hand of the Edomites? And not recall the covenant between the parts, but which you selected those you tested. So again, it's an interesting sort of alliterative rhyme scheme here, or alliterative style to the poem with aleph and then bet and then gimel and then dalet, and some very, very complicated words. Some of them are not like typical words. Look at the last line, for example, below zacharta deligas dilug derach asher dalagta lidgalecha. And here it translates, not recall the contraction of the road you shortened for your flag-bearing tribes, which refers to midrashim about how the Jewish people were redeemed, and it uses some very interesting words, dilog derach and the use of flags, lit galecha. So again, a lot of very interesting uses of Hebrew, a lot of interesting uses of midrash, a lot of interesting uses of psukim and rhyme scheme. So that's very typical of Rav Elazar HaKalir. Very creative use of the Hebrew language. And again, when Rav Elazar HaKalir wrote these piyutim, like for the keynote, they were krovot, meaning we have keynote today as a separate service. Like after we finish davening, basically we continue and we recite keynote, and they're numbered and we recite them. But originally, it would seem that in Eretz Yisrael, these were inserted into Shemona Esrei itself, into the repetition of Shemona Esrei in the bracha of Yerushalayim, or as we saw, Yerushalayim and Tzemach being combined. That these on Tisha B'av they would insert these special improvisational almost compositions that they wrote for that day to talk about the tragedy of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. But we now don't do that anymore. We don't put them in Shemona Esrei, but we've sort of put them in a separate service, but we have maintained them nonetheless, so they're not gone. Now, I will say that not everyone was happy with piyut, with poetry in davening. The Gaonim in Bavel, in particular, were very upset about this. They were dismayed by the fact that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael were so free with their prayers and were willing to incorporate all this new poetry, even something skipping over some of the words in the bracha of Shemona Esrei. Some of the sharpest words on the subject, I think, we'll see in source number 6, are written by the rabbinic scholar Pirkoi ben Baboy, who lived in the 8th or 9th century in Bavel. And this is a letter that he wrote to the Jews of Spain and North Africa. And this is what he says in the letter. V'shanu chachamenu zechronim levracha, and our sages taught us, Kol hamashana al mabea shetava chachamenu zechronim levracha lo yatzai yedei chavasa. Anyone who deviates from the wording of the sages, mashana matbea, that's a term that's often used with regard to tefillah. We call like the matbea hatefillah, the sort of the form of the coin almost of prayer. And he says, if you deviate from this, you don't fulfill your obligation. Kol hamosiv harizeh mecharef u'megadef. And one who adds them is actually a blasphemer. Bo or evi misha spal shmona esrei b'mos hachama. Think about this: one who's davening Shmona Esrei in the summer, v'shachach v'hiskir mored hageshem, and he says the prayer for rain, which you don't say in the summer. B'shvil shehiskir lahosiv davar echad be'esh lo tinu chachamenu. He added just one thing where he wasn't supposed to add it. Ein tefillah so tefillah. It's not a good tefillah. V'chozer u'mispal tefillah acheres, and he has to go back and do it again. The Kol Shekain, he says, certainly, She'asar Lomer Hakel Hagadol Hagibor V'Anara, don't start Shmona Esrei with those words, Umasik Shvachot Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then stop praising Hashem, Umaskil Mizamer V'Yavo Amalek V'Echa Evke V'Choch Yotzebo, and start reciting all these different poetries, like about Amalek, and how can, various piyutim and stuff like that. And he says, how can you do that? So he's particularly upset, and this is, other Gaonim say this as well, is that given the emphasis the Chazal placed on the precise formulation of brachot, it is thoroughly inappropriate, in his opinion, to insert poetry into Shemona Esrei. He's particularly upset if you do it in the opening 3 blessings of Shemona Esrei. So this is sort of a polemic against the Jews of Eretz Yisrael who were doing this on a regular basis. And certainly the Gaonim's opposition to piyut and the Gaonim's opposition to the Nusach Eretz Yisrael contributed to the decline of Nusach Eretz Yisrael. One really interesting feature, you'll see this in the Siddur of Amram Gaon, and I hope actually to give a class on the Haggadah before Pesach this year. We'll see. We'll see, and we'll talk about this in more depth. There's a really important source in the Haggadah. There's actually, because in Siddur of Amram Gaon, they also have the Haggadah of Pesach, and there's this really interesting polemic from Rav Amram Gaon's predecessor, Rav Natronai Gaon, in Surah, where he says, he calls out this Haggadah as being awful, and it's a Karaite Haggadah. He says the Karaites, were the opponents of the Gaonim in Bavel. They didn't believe in the rabbinic tradition. They didn't believe in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. And he basically calls out this whole other Haggadah that he found, and he says, you can't possibly use this. This is terrible. But it seems it was actually the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael. It was not Karaite at all. It was actually the Nusach the Jews were using in the land of Israel. And this type of opposition to the Nusach Eretz Yisrael from the Gaonim is certainly part of what led to its decline. The Gaonim as the arbiters sort of Jewish law in that time, and the real heads of the diaspora really asserted a great deal of authority and a great deal of influence on the rest of the Jewish community. So Piyut certainly loses some of its luster because of the attacks of the Gaonim. However, as we'll see right now, the Gaonim also accepted it to a certain degree. And you can see this in this tshuva from Rav Nachman Gaon in source number 7. L'Rabbeinu Nachman Gaon, Omim Piyutim ba'avos gvuros. If you say Piyutim in the first bracha of Avos and the second bracha of Shema, gvuros v'chol tfilos, and all the prayers v'chol regel v'regel, and on every holiday, Me'inyanenu umarbim bo devrei agado v'Tisha B'av v'Purim, and you also say words of midrash on Tisha B'av and Purim. Im amrim b'chol bracha u'bracha me'ein osa bracha. As long as in every bracha you say something that's similar to that bracha. Uva Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippur divrei ritzo eslichos, and you say words of appeasement and words of penitential prayers. Uva Tisha B'av divrei chorban habayis. On Tisha B'av you talk about the destruction of the temple. That is allowed. So the important part is you have to say something that's related to the context of that bracha. And then you can say other things. And then you can add other things. You can add other types of praise and other stuff like that. So Rav Nachman Gaon is basically saying down this principle: as long as you are keeping with the theme of the bracha and saying things that are related to the opening and closing of the bracha, it is permissible to include piyutim. And this is more or less.
Is this relevant to uvechein tein pachtecha?
I think uvechein tein pachtecha isn't really a piyut. I think uvechein tein pachtecha is really part of the statutory, I would call, prayer for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I'm not 100% sure, and I'd have to look into it more. It could be that it kind of started out more in a piyut type way. But it seems like at some early point already, it was already accepted as part of the standard liturgy. And I don't think it would really fall under this category. I might be caught a little off guard here. I'm not sure if I'm getting that completely right, but I feel like I've read that before, but I can look into it again.
But question.
Yeah.
Other than Akdamos and Yotziv Pitgam, are there any other piyutim which were composed or attempted in a language other than Hebrew? In other words, were they attempted, let's say, in Arabic or Ladino or Chas v'Shalom in English? We know, of course, of Akdamos and Yotziv Pitgam, which are fairly late, which are not in Hebrew. But were there other such attempts?
Yes, definitely. This is like a whole big topic also, but certainly there were there were other Arabic ones, there are Aramaic. Yeah, I mean, again, like what was incorporated into davening and where, I'm not 100% sure, but certainly in regard to Aramaic, like there's quite a bit of literature. I mean, Akdamos and Yitziv Piskam, for example, are just two. Why they stayed in our Siddur is a whole question. I'd love to give a share on that too. I have a lot to say about that. But those were like two examples of what we call a reshus. What the reshus basically was is we're asking permission to translate the Torah into Aramaic, because that was something that was done for a long time, is that they would read the Torah in Hebrew, but they would also translate into Aramaic. And sometimes they would add piyutim, reshus piyutim, that were basically asking permission to translate into Aramaic. And that's what Akdamos and Yitziv Piskam were. That's kind of been forgotten now, but that's originally what they were for. But they're just those are just two examples, but there were many other reshus piyutim, for example. And yes, there were all sorts of poetry written in different languages. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second as well. Again, how much was incorporated into davening, I'm not completely sure at every stage. Okay, but as we saw though, okay, yeah. So we see though that piyut, although it was limited by the Gaonim, it still stayed, and particularly it stayed in Nusach Ashkenaz again. And part of the reason that it stayed particularly in Nusach Ashkenaz is because we talked about this deep affinity between Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Eretz Yisrael. And it seems like, again, the Jews came from Eretz Yisrael to maybe the Byzantine Empire, then to Italy, and then to France and Germany and England. And that's why, as we saw, we say some of the endings still for Nusach Eretz Yisrael at different times of the year for the different brachos, like Shos Chalavat Chabira Na'avod, Kadosh Tav and Arash Shemach. We still say that. We still say those things, but we also say a lot more piyutim in Ashkenaz than are said in the Sephardic lands, and particularly the piyutim of Rabbi Elazar HaKalir and others like him maintained a special place in Ashkenaz. And part of the reason for this is actually because in Ashkenaz they felt that Elazar Kalir was of a very great stature. They actually believed he was one of the Tanaim, that he was actually one of the Mishnaic sages. And we see this in source number 8. I gave you one example of this. It says, Sarchei Rabim Shoralim Kagon Shevach V'Chavod Hayom Shrabim Srichim, that you're allowed to ask the needs of the many Yom Shabbos. Umitamzen, because of this, Anu Omim Krovetz Begimel Rishono. So we still say the Krovot in the first 3 bracha, the piyutim. V'chein iskimu of Yosef Tov Elam, Rabbeinu Eliyahu Zaken. So of Yosef Tov Elam, who wrote many piyutim himself, and Rabbeinu Eliyahu Zaken, but also biyad the mutar umitzah min amuvchar, that you're allowed to say the piyutim. It's actually great to say them. V'chein kalir, and the kalir yasad krovetz. But he wrote the krovat. V'hu ayam mikiryas sefer. He was actually from Kiryas Sefer. It says uviyamav hayam mikashon al piyariyah, and he lived in a time where they were still sanctifying the new moon based on witnesses before the fixed calendar. Tana, and he was a Tana, he was a Mishnaic sage. V'ulai hai Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, maybe he was Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. Kedamash Pesikta, as is implied in the Pesikta. Va'afilum eno Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. Tana hai, he was still a Tana, Kedeprecious, as we explained, Va'alav yesh lismach, and you can rely on him, Kipir Rabbeinu Tam, as Rabbeinu Tam explained. So he's saying something very interesting here. Rabbeinu Tam popularized this notion that Elazar HaKalir was not just a Paitan. He say from Eretz Yisrael, he was actually one of the Tanaim. Now, historically, this doesn't seem to work out. Scholars think that Elazar HaKalir lived in the 600s and the 700s, so we're talking like a good 500 years after the time of the Tanaim. But at the same time, you can see the high regard that they held for Kalir in Ashkenaz and why so many of his piyutim were not only preserved, but other people wrote complicated piyutim in the same style as him, which are part of Ashkenaz. We're starting to lose a little bit of this now. Some of these piyutim are falling out of favor, like some of the Yotzros and other things are not said so much anymore in Ashkenaz, but they were always a very big part of Ashkenaz, so that this continuity between the land of Israel and the piyutim there and Ashkenaz of today. Now, just to finish up a little here, we talked about how piyut is very central in Ashkenaz, not as central in Sfarad. Well, this isn't exactly the case. They didn't like piyutim, paitanim like Kalir in Sfarad, but their problems were more that he was just so hard to understand. They didn't necessarily, some people like the Rambam were very against piyutim in general, and he thought you shouldn't say them at all. But most of the other poskim, even in Spanish lands, felt that you should say piyutim as long as you stuck within the framework of the Gaonim and you didn't alter the bracha too much. It was okay to say piyutim. But in Spain, they were more influenced by the Arabic poetry of their time. And many of these people were actually writing poetry in Arabic as well. And they were paying attention to things like rhyme and meter and things like that. I have here in source number 9 what Rav Avram ibn Ezra said. He has a famous piece in his commentary on Kohelet where he goes through a whole thing about how the piyutim are so difficult to understand, they're so ungrammatical, they're too abstruse, they're too midrashic. He particularly calls out Elazar Kalir and how he doesn't like Kalir's piyutim because of these problems. And I just gave you one line from his commentary here in source number 9. He says, and I can't even explain 1,000th of the way the paitanim are mistaken. Don't say them at all. Just stick with the fixed prayers. It says, do not say these extra piyutim. But the thing what's interesting is that Ibn Ezra, like many others from Spain, wasn't satisfied with that in the end because he actually composed his own piyutim. So in Spain, they're not using the piyutim of Kalir that we use in Ashkenaz, but they're using their own piyutim. And this is something you'll notice is interesting is, let's say you go tomorrow, let's say you're in Ashkenaz, you daven Ashkenaz, you usually go tomorrow and you daven in a Sephardic shul. The davening is very similar. A lot of the words you're going to say are the same. If you go on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, I never did it, but I'm told that very hard to follow because so much of what we do in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is piyutim, is this poetry, and they have totally different poetry because they didn't accept a lot of the ancient Eretz Yisrael poetry, and they used their own poetry that were written in their lands. I'll give you just one example here in source number 10. I think this one's a particularly beautiful one. You can actually sort of see the contrast between this style of poetry and the style we saw earlier from Elazar HaKalir. This is what Ibn Ezra wrote. It's Lecha Keli Teshukati, which is basically praising God and just are talking about our longing for God. I gave you like a little bit of the translation here, just like, to you, my God, is my longing, for you is my love and my desire. And then the last line that I give you, actually, I didn't even give you this one in Hebrew, I don't think. Oh, no, I did. Lecha ezak becha edbak adei shuvi la'admati. To you I cry, to you I cleave until I return to earth. It's just such a simple language, simple Hebrew language, and very, very moving. Very moving. And in fact, Sephardim generally like this one so much by Ibn Ezra that this is how they begin their Yom Kippur service, not with Kol Nidre. I think that many Sephardim still say Kol Nidre, but before Kol Nidre, they have this piyut. And there's like a beautiful setting by Yishai Ribo that you can find online for this, and I really think it's a very moving piyut. Last time I gave this year, I sang the couple bars. I guess I'll do that again. Why not? Lecha eli teshukasi, lecha cheshki ve'ahavati, lecha libi v'chilyotai, lecha ruchi v'nishmati, lecha yadai, lecha raglai, u'mimachi techonati, lecha tzmi, lecha dami, ve'orim gviati. So you can sort of get a sense, at least in Yishai Ribo's rendering, which I think is one of the traditional melodies for this piyut, how it goes. And I really like the way that it can really, sort of this longing for God can really set a beautiful stage for our Yom Kippur tefillot, and this is what they do in Sephardic lands. So you sort of get a sense of how Sephardim do have piyutim and still incorporated piyutim, but they're different. They're different, and they have a different style to them. So to sum this up, big difference between Tefillah and Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. Eretz Yisrael was more into poetry, more into free form, less into the fixed Tefillah. Bavel was more standardized. And in terms of the standardized fixed prayer between these two places, there were differences. But once the Gaonim came on the scene, the Gaonim curtailed the use of piyut to some degree. They also standardized more the text of the Siddur. So although we find in the Geniza fragments of the ancient Eretz Yisrael Nosach, most of it is no longer used today, except in some places in Ashkenaz at certain times. But Siddur Amram Gaon was kind of the standardizing force. In the next class, we'll look more about the Gaonim standardization of the Siddur, the writing down of the Siddur, and then as the Siddur was distributed throughout different places, and other things came into the mix, like Kabbalah, and also the printing press, we get more changes for the Siddur, but paradoxically, almost, the more the Siddur changes, the more it kind of coalesces and moves toward the standard Siddur that we have today. Okay, so let's see.
I think you should mention Meir Soloveitchik's article about davening without the Netanel Tokef. It's a classical article.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I've seen it. Maybe send it to me though, because maybe I haven't seen it. It sounds familiar, but
He published it in commentary.
Okay, yeah, he writes a lot there. Okay, so let's see. We have one comment here, Yosef Dov Robinson. If the reading of the Torah were still on the triennial cycle, say the Ashkenazi world, Shabbat morning service would be considerably different, and Balei Kriya wouldn't have to practice as much of the public Torah reading. Yes, that's true. It would be a lot shorter. And if you think about it, though, this is why piyut could be such an important part of tefillah there, because the piyut was long and complicated, but the Torah reading was shorter, so they had more time, I think, to do this, and they could keep people's attention more. I think that's an important part of it, that the shorter Torah reading contributed to that. And also these, as I said, like they also had Targum, probably, where they were translating the Torah into Aramaic, and they wrote piyutim for the Targum as well to introduce the Targum and stuff like that. So there was a lot of stuff going on, but really very different than what we do today. Certainly a different world. Okay, so I think that takes care of the questions in the chat. We have additional 6 minutes, so I'd be happy to hear other comments or questions or disagreements or what have you.
Well, this is a bit of topic, but the difference in Yosef and Yosef are between Shabbos and the rest of the week. Is that pure, or does it have where does that come from?
Yeah, again, I'm probably not going to be able to answer your question directly because I need to look up exactly what we know about the origins of this. But I think it's safe to say that some of these differences are really quite old already. Meaning that like when you have a text that the basic contours of the text are fixed, that is Yotzer or we're talking about the light of creation, but there are different tefillah. Like you might have Shabbos and you might have Yom Tov, and you might have the weekday. So there are going to be people who are composing different texts for these different things, and somehow it all coalesces at some point together. I don't, but again, I don't know that we have to go on to saying that this is particularly like piyut per se. It's more like that like as the liturgy was coalescing and developing, there were sort of different strands where for Shabbos they would say one thing and for the weekday they would say something else. And I don't think we really know like who composed like all the intricacies of how that diverges. But certainly I think it is safe to say that like there was a time when there was a lot of more composing going on. And only became fixed later. But I can try to see what we know about the development of that. But my guess is that we don't know a lot specifically about how that came to be.
Excuse me, I was in Zurich for Shabbos, beginning of July, on a regular Shabbos, and they said what you now describe as krovos. I think one of them was Tiluk, and it was pretty extensive, pretty elaborate. Are you aware of
That's
that?
really interesting. No, I'm not aware of that in Zurich. This is just on a regular Shabbos?
A regular Shabbos. They have their own Siddur that's very similar. The Nusach is all very much like Breuer's, but they have many, particularly Zurich variations on things. So maybe you wanted, I would have loved to get a copy of the Siddur, but I was only there on Shabbos. I couldn't take one.
Yeah.
And it's
that's
worth
always
looking into.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's always a tricky thing. I agree. Like I hear about all these other Siddurim and stuff like that, but it's not always easy to find them online, especially if it's something newer that's actually still in use. It's very hard to find it online, so then I can't see what's going on. Because I think like in Breuer, so when we're talking about Breuer's, we're talking about the congregation in Washington Heights that follows the German tradition. So they do say piyutim, but I don't think they do it every week. I think they only do it on special Shabbatot and on Yom Tov. So it's interesting that in Zurich they do it every week. And thank you. Other comments, questions?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see this very passionate, moving poetry, longing for Hashem of Ibn Ezra. He also has Samalacha Nafshi, and yet he's usually regarded as a cold grammarian who's hiding some problematic view. It's like a totally different person, you see.
Yeah, I guess Irene is not here today. She's usually the expert on Ibn Ezra, but yeah, I think it's safe to say that Ibn Ezra had many different facets to him. I mean, this is someone who spent his whole life traveling through different Jewish communities. He really didn't stay in one place for very long, and certainly like his commentary on the Torah is often viewed as very grammatical, very sometimes he likes to hide things, as you said. But yeah, he seems to also have this poetic side to him, which I think is important to highlight. Yeah, thank you for that. Well, if there aren't any further questions, I will we'll wrap up here now, and I look forward to seeing you all same time next week, same location, and we'll talk more about the Siddur as it becomes more standardized. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.